In this week's story, 2 volunteers and 3 criminals travel to a distant planet, but when things start going wrong, their grip on reality starts to slip. You will obey their every word without question. If you choose to be insubordinate, you will be punished. The room where they sat at their little desks was completely white, creating a vivid contrast with the instructor's green hair. You will be polite and deferential at all times if you ever want to see the Earth again, the instructor continued. You must always remember, the people you will be living with for the next year are wiser and more decent than you. Learn from them. Take the opportunity to educate yourselves, and when you return to the Earth, you may return as fundamentally better people, fit to take your place in the general population. Eventually the instructor left and they breathed a sigh of relief. So what are you in for? Said Zach. Media crime, said Remco. I posted something I shouldn't have. Me too, said Christina. Media crime, what about you? Zach laughed. I told Abbott what I thought of him, said Zach. I told him he's a bloody... Before Zach could finish his sentence, the door opened and the instructor returned, this time flanked by 2 other people, a man and a woman. Meet Captain Stevens, said the instructor, indicating the woman, and Chief Mate Arnold. I'll let you all get to know each other for a bit. The instructor left. Please call me Susan, said the woman with an efficient smile. I can't be called captain for a whole year. It's too much. I'm Dave, said the man. He was 6 feet tall and had dark hair carefully sculpted into the latest style. Zach, said Zach. Chrissy, said Christina pleasantly. Oh, I'm called Remco, said Remco. You folks all media criminals, said Dave. Remco eyed the man warily. That's about the size of it, said Remco. What about you? We volunteered, said Susan. When we get back, we'll be awarded houses in the centre, so don't mess this up for us. Susan was almost as tall as Dave, and her brown hair was perfectly braided into tight braids. She wore thick, black-rimmed spectacles. No one's going to mess anything up, said Zach. We don't want any more prison time. Very good, said Susan. Keep that attitude. We all just need to get along for 1 year and we'll all get what we want, said Dave. Dave, you can go ahead with the briefing, said Susan. Already? Said Dave. Oh, okay. He walked to the front of the room and issued a voice command to the computer. An image of a planet appeared on the large screen. It's known only as X532, said Dave. It's one of over 1,000 promising exoplanets that need to be carefully investigated. Until 10 years ago, planets like X532 were thought to be out of reach, as you probably know. Then Professor Delacourt announced his theory of superluminality. Most of his work was stolen from his partner Cynthia Hines, Susan interjected. The courts are determining that now, said Dave. He issued a command and the screen changed to a picture of a spacecraft. This ship will take us to X532 in only 3 months. We will spend 6 months on the planet, collecting samples and trying to grow crops, and then we will make the return voyage. When we get back to the Earth, a year will have passed for us, but 100 years will have passed on the Earth. As long as Abbott's dead, I'm fine with it, muttered Zach. What? Said Dave. Nothing, said Zach. All 3 of you will need to show us that you're fit to be returned to society, said Susan. If any of you step out of line, we will have to put that in your report, so you'd better behave. Exactly, said Dave. We expect only the best from all 3 of you. At 4 in the morning on the 5th of June 2152, the 5 reluctant astronauts filed into the spacecraft HR Equity. The living quarters for Zach, Remco and Chrissy were cramped but serviceable. 4 square meters, said Zach. This is twice what I had previously. The new pods are tiny, said Chrissy. I hate them. If this planet's any good, we should just stay on it, said Remco. Dave and Susan, leading the way, were immersed in private conversation. I've got a feeling it's not going to be good, said Zach. The aircraft had no bridge, but it possessed a viewing deck where the five assembled to watch the liftoff. The ship's iron thrusters ignited with flares resembling brilliant green flames to observers on the Earth, and the ship began to climb slowly into the sky. Once beyond the atmosphere, the crew looked back solemnly at the blue marble of the Earth. I feel as though I'm not going to see it again, said Zach. Don't be silly, of course you will, said Chrissy with a smile. Need to watch that negative attitude, Zach, said Susan. I can and will dock points off your final score if you carry on like this. Sorry, said Zach. Captain, said Susan. Sorry, Captain, said Zach. He rolled his eyes at Remco and Chrissy, and they suppressed a giggle. Chrissy covering her mouth, and Remco turning abruptly as though he'd suddenly spotted an interesting constellation. Hyperdrive should engage at any moment now, said Dave. 15 minutes later, they were beginning to get bored. Then suddenly there was a slight sensation of movement, and the stars all blinked and rearranged themselves as if a switch had been pulled. You hardly feel anything, said Susan. Another few hundred of those and we'll soon be there, said Dave. Well, I'm going to catch up on some reading, said Zach, rising to his feet. Be ready to start work by 8 a.m. tomorrow, said Susan. There's a lot to do before we get there. Later that day, Remco, Chrissy and Zach assembled quietly in Zach's tiny room. Remco had obtained a copy of their work schedule, which he passed around on a tablet. It doesn't look too bad, said Remco. Holistic reimagining, said Zach incredulously. Dealing with negative thoughts towards others, understanding bias, personal and social development. I don't know if I can deal with 3 months of this. It won't be that bad, said Chrissy. Just tell them what they want to hear. Remco was leaning back against the wall, smiling. I had to do 6 months once, he said. The way I look at it, at least I'm not starving. Honestly, I'd rather be wrestling with aliens, said Zach. Who's going to be teaching us all this rubbish? Captain Susan? A lot of it's automated, said Remco. I hope we crash into an asteroid, said Zach. We'll learn practical stuff as well, said Chrissy. There must be a ton of stuff we actually need to know before we get there. Remco scrolled through the lesson list. In a month we've got a lesson about how to use the helmets, he said. 3 months later they made one final hyperspatial jump and a planet appeared. They stood watching on the viewing deck as the ship slowly approached the planet's atmosphere. Might be a bit bumpy, said Dave. The atmosphere's quite thick. They descended slowly through layers of cloud and mist, until eventually they could see the surface of the planet through the portals in the floor. Looks a bit greenish, said Chrissy. There's some vegetation down there, said Susan. Probably all toxic. The ship touched down on a wide, flat plain. No trace of anything green in sight. Surface is mainly salt, said Dave, staring at the readouts. Air's not breathable, slightly corrosive. Pressure almost 1 atmosphere. How long before the living quarters are assembled? Remco asked, gazing out at the endless arid landscape. No more than a day, said Susan. Remember, you'll need to wear your suit when we exit the ship. It might look okay out there, but it's actually not very hospitable. This would need huge terraforming to support any significant number of people, said Dave, shaking his head. Bit of a wasted trip. It's not so much the destination that matters, said Zach. It's what you learn along the way. Susan looked at him suspiciously. He was smiling slightly, but she couldn't be certain that he was being sarcastic. That's right, she said. A door in the ship opened somewhere with a resounding clang. and the first of the construction robots rolled out onto the salt plain. It seemed to hesitate for a moment, then it began to drill holes in the ground. Soon another robot joined it and stuck poles into the holes. The next day they put on their spacesuits and stepped outside. The suits completely covered them in a metal protective shell, but the faces of the suits projected reconstructions of their faces onto the outside of the suits. It was almost as though they could look each other in the face, but there was something slightly off about the experience, as Chrissy noted. "We won't have to wear them for long," said Dave. "Let's get inside." They opened the main airlock of the newly constructed base. Inside, the base was huge. "I can't believe they built this in a single day," said Chrissy. "The technology's really impressive," said Remco. "We've got nearly 10,000 square meters to grow crops," said Dave. "Nothing's going to grow in this salty filth," said Zach. "We'll desalinate it," said Dave. "We are here to figure out how to make things grow," said Susan. Later that day they watched the spaceship take off from a large communal room in the base with a huge wraparound window. "Where's it going?" said Chrissy. "It's off to take some other colonists home from a planet a few light years away," said Dave. "I feel abandoned," said Chrissy. "It'll be back in 6 months," said Dave. The day after, Zach and Chrissy were assigned to go and fetch soil for the experimental indoor farm, while Remco ran tests on soil samples, attempting to render the unpromising soil into something fit to grow crops with. "Why me?" said Zach. "I hate this stupid spacesuit." "Hard work will do you good," said Susan. "Might improve your attitude a bit." "Might improve your attitude a bit," Zach echoed quietly in a mocking tone as he and Chrissy left for the vehicle port. As Zach and Chrissy trundled along the salt plain in an electric caterpillar hauler, Chrissy tried to make conversation. "We're supposed to check for a kilometre around the station," she said. "All looks the same to me." "It is all the same," said Zach. "Look at it. The entire planet's probably like this." "There must have been sea here once," said Chrissy. "No sign of it now," said Zach, and he lapsed into silence. A bit later on, Chrissy tried again. "What do you think of Dave and Susan?" she said. "Dave's a moron and Susan's bloody insufferable," said Zach. "I seriously think we should mutiny." "They'll never let us go back to the Earth if we do that," said Chrissy. "It's just 6 months. Hang in there." "And another 3 months all the way back again," said Zach. "Seems a bit softer just here," said Chrissy. "Let's see if the excavator can dig some up." They disembarked and set the excavator robot to work. "Looks like clay," said Zach, as the robot piped soil into the caterpillar's skips. "Can we grow things in clay?" said Chrissy. "I don't think so," said Zach. "They should have sent Remco, he knows more about this kind of thing." "At least we've got away from them a bit," said Chrissy. "Yeah, true," said Zach. He leaned over and peered closely at the soil. "There are things growing in it though," he said. Chrissy squatted down to examine the ground. "Tiny blue plants," she said. "They're pretty." "You know, these suits are a pile of nonsense," said Zach. "There's oxygen in the air. There are things growing here. I'm going to take my helmet off. I'm sweating like a pig in here." "Don't do that," said Chrissy, alarmed. "Are you crazy? The computer says it's not breathable." Zach was already beginning to unfasten his helmet. "Just for a minute," he said. "If I pass out, you can fix my helmet on again, can't you?" Chrissy grabbed his hands. "Don't do it," she said. "Please." Her simulated facial projection seemed anguished. Zach hesitated, but finally he said, "Oh, okay then, never mind. Let's just get on with it and get back inside. But I'm telling you, this is nonsense." The following day was a Saturday. Susan and Dave decided to hold what they called a seminar. They sat in a room in front of a touchscreen. "The aim of this seminar is to raise your sense of inner worth," said Susan. Zach raised his hand. "Yes," said Susan. Is this mandatory? He said. Yes, it's in your program, said Susan. Are there more questions? Zach sighed, and Remco and Chrissy exchanged amused glances. Your problem, said Dave, all three of you, is that you are in a you're not okay, I'm not okay kind of a place. You need to take a you're okay, I'm okay stance on society. That starts with acknowledging that we all have special qualities and talents, said Susan. We're all special, all of us. I'm going to point at you one by one, and I want each of you to share something about yourselves that makes you special. I'll start. I'm special because I'm a very creative person. I like to write poems. She looked at Dave. I'm special because I'm really good at mathematics, said Dave. Thank you, Dave, said Susan. Then she pointed at Remco. Remco? She said. Remco looked at Chrissy and Zach, but found no succour. I'm special because I have a qualification in robot maintenance, he said. Dave started to write this information down on the touchscreen, but Susan interrupted. Very good, said Susan, but that's something you've acquired. Tell us something about you, about how you are. Remco stared at the ceiling. Then he blew out his lips, making a sound like a horse. It could even be some unique birthmark you've got, or a scar, said Susan. Anything that makes you special. I've got a scar on my knee, said Remco, brightening. I was repairing a cleaning robot and a window blade activated unexpectedly and... Okay, said Susan quickly. I'm special because I've got a scar on my knee, said Remco. Very good, said Susan. If we feel special ourselves, we feel less of a need to attack others online, Remco. Yeah, said Remco. Chrissy, said Susan. I've got a scar on my knee too, said Chrissy quickly. I'm special because I've also got a scar on my knee. Okay, said Susan. Zach? Yeah, I've got a scar on my knee, said Zach. Try to think of something else, said Susan. We've already had 2 knee scars now. What knee are your scars on? Zach said to Chrissy and Remco. Left, said Chrissy. Left, said Remco. Well, mine's on my right knee, said Zach. That evening, Dave and Susan were eating together when Susan suddenly broke into tears. Hey, what's wrong? Said Dave. They hate me, said Susan. They're media criminals, said Dave. Who cares what they think? Sometimes I feel like everyone hates me, said Susan. I think you're okay, said Dave. Susan's tears intensified. We get on pretty well, said Dave. You don't hate me, said Susan. No, said Dave. Look, this is a difficult situation. We knew it would be. We've just got to get through another 9 months. Less than 9 months. Then we'll get our own houses. Imagine that, Susan. Yes, said Susan, blowing her nose noisily. I suppose you're right. It'll be worth it in the end, said Dave. They're not even eating with us, said Susan. I prefer it when it's just the 2 of us, said Dave. Really, said Susan. For sure, said Dave. They're really annoying, especially Zach. They are annoying, said Susan, laughing. On Sunday, Susan insisted they all eat lunch together. How's the soil analysis coming on? Dave asked Remco. Not very promising, said Remco. I think we should take more samples outside, maybe look further afield. We're only authorised to search within 5 square kilometres, said Dave. We could try a bit further. Yeah, that's some stupid nonsense, said Zach. What do you mean? Said Susan. We've landed in the middle of a salt plain. Why can't we investigate the rest of the planet? Other teams will do that, said Dave. I'm sick of these stupid rules, said Zach. Play the game, Zach, said Remco. It's not so bad. At least we're not starving. Maybe I'd rather starve than eat this slop, said Zach. What's your attitude? Said Susan. We all need to cooperate here. The whole reason you're here is to learn to be more positive and work off your debt to society. Screw this, said Zack abruptly, and he stood up and walked off. Hey Zack, come back, said Remco, but Zack paid him no attention. Let him go, said Chrissy. He's just in a bad mood today. He's always in a bad mood, said Susan. They continued eating in silence. After a while, Dave said, I want you two to go out and collect some more soil samples this afternoon. Sure, said Remco. We could... Then he stopped, suddenly staring at the liquid crystal windows. What? Said Susan. Then she turned around and said, Oh, flipping heck. Outside, Zack was standing in his spacesuit, unfastening his helmet. We have to stop him, said Dave, and he bolted for the airlock. The others followed him. It's jammed, he said, prodding the green and blue illuminated buttons by the primary airlock. He's jammed it. Zack was still visible through the windows. He was rotating his helmet. What about the vehicle airlock? Said Remco. Dave was about to reply when Zack lifted his helmet off. Oh no, said Susan. Zack smiled. Then a pained expression came over his face and he began to cough. Maybe he's joking, said Chrissy. Zack's face began to blister and blood abruptly spewed out of his mouth. Remco ran for the vehicle airlock. Go and help him, said Susan to Chrissy. Chrissy was frozen in shock. Chrissy, said Susan. Chrissy snapped out of it and ran to help Remco. She found Remco in the vehicle port, frantically jabbing at the airlock control pad. He's deliberately jammed this one as well, he said. It's going to take hours to figure out how. They walked briskly back to the main hall. Susan was crying and Dave was trying to console her. Outside, Zack was lying in a large pool of his own blood, steaming slightly. It's also jammed, said Remco. Try to repair it, said Dave. It's going to take hours, maybe all day, said Remco. Just do what you can, said Dave. Not until nearly midnight did Remco succeed in figuring out how Zack had jammed the access points and how to repair them. By then it was dark, and they decided to wait till the sun came up before retrieving Zack's corpse. On Monday, they ate a somber breakfast together in one of the smaller rooms, so they didn't have to see Zack's body while they ate. It's only less than 3 months, said Dave, shaking his head. He didn't have to kill himself. He was convinced the air is breathable, said Chrissy. He didn't mean to kill himself. He thought he'd be okay without the helmet. Idiot, said Susan bitterly, a tear in her eye. She's crying for herself, thought Remco, but instead of that he said, We'd better go and get him in. We can cremate him. After breakfast they filed into the main hall and switched on the liquid crystal windows. Where's he gone? Said Chrissy in surprise. There was a stained area of ground where Zack's body had lain, but no sign of Zack. It's possible an animal got him, said Remco. There aren't any animals here, said Susan. Why not? Said Remco. There are plants. Chrissy shuddered. We'd better go out and check properly, she said. Remco, Dave and Chrissy went out to search for Zack's body. Susan said she had work to do. They scoured the area, but all they found was his helmet, a few 100 meters away from the base. It might have got blown here by the wind, said Dave. They stood around it for a while until Dave said, Better get back inside. 6 months passed slowly but uneventfully. Susan refused to lead any more seminars and instead Dave led them alone, but they all knew they were simply going through the motions. It was a pointless requirement of their contract, nothing more. Susan spent a lot of time alone, crying. If Dave envied the friendship between Chrissy and Remco, he kept it to himself. They experienced some limited success in growing crops on the unyielding clay, but they weren't able to grow enough to potentially feed themselves. Most plants simply refuse to grow in the thick, muddy earth, even after desalination. Only potatoes and cassava seemed vaguely tolerant of it. Eventually, the time came to return home. They assembled outside, waiting for the spacecraft to return. "So is it going to be the same one that brought us here?" Chrissy asked. "I have no idea," said Remco. "They just send whichever one's closest," said Dave. After a while, Dave said, "It's late." "I thought they precisely calculated flight times," said Susan. "They do," said Dave. "It might have to detour around asteroids," said Remco. They waited for another half hour, but no ship appeared. They trudged disconsolately inside. "There must be some way to contact Earth," said Susan. "There's no way," said Remco. "It's too far." "What about near planets then?" said Susan. Remco shook his head. "The signal would take years to reach them." "It'll turn up soon," said Dave. "It has to." But the ship didn't turn up. Not the following day, nor the day after that. When 2 weeks had passed and everyone was feeling the strain, Susan called an official meeting in the main hall. Outside, the stain where Zach had died was still visible. "Okay, everyone," said Susan, hitting a glass with a spoon to quell the chatter. The strain was clearly visible on her face, and Dave looked as though he hadn't slept in a while. "We don't have any scheduled work because this contingency was not anticipated, but we'll carry on with our agricultural experiments. The ship should be here soon. It must have got delayed. I wanted to call a meeting so we can all feel empowered to raise any questions that any of us might have." "Are the seminars going to continue?" said Remco. "I feel as though I've grown enough now as a person." "No more seminars," said Susan. Remco and Chrissy smiled at each other. "I'm not being paid for this," said Chrissy. "I don't see why I should work." "That's a very unhelpful attitude," said Susan. "If you don't work, I'll have to note that in my report. It will affect your score." "I was sentenced to a year," said Chrissy. 6 months of it was supposed to be on this planet. I don't see how this time counts. It's extra time now." "I agree," said Remco. "You must do as you see fit," said Susan sternly. "Maybe it's a test," said Dave. "What do you mean?" said Susan. Dave paused, then said, "I don't know. I mean, maybe it's some kind of test." Susan looked at him suspiciously. He hadn't shaved, and he looked slightly spaced out. "Okay, that concludes the meeting unless anyone has anything else to say," she said. "You really have no idea when the ship's coming?" said Remco. "We know only what you know," said Susan. 100 years passes on Earth for every year of our expedition," said Remco. "Doesn't that mean, by Earth standards, the ship's 200 weeks late?" "That's not how it works," said Dave. "Time dilation is only involved in the trip to and from the Earth. Really, about 50 years have passed on the Earth since we left, due to the journey here. Every week we spend on this planet now is a week on Earth also. So really there's no need to worry," said Susan, in a complete non sequitur, as though trying to convince herself. Not until 2 months had passed did Dave begin to flesh out his theory. They were eating lunch together when Dave, whose behaviour was becoming increasingly erratic, began to explain what had been on his mind. "How do we know we're actually on another planet?" he said. "What are you talking about?" said Susan. "I mean, there are salt flats on the Earth. Africa, America. How do we know we're not still on Earth?" "You saw what happened to Zach," said Chrissy. "We never found his body," said Dave. "He could have been an actor, a plant." "Why would he be an actor?" said Susan. "You're talking nonsense." "Just think about it," said Dave. "Maybe they're testing us to see how long it takes us to figure out that we're really on the Earth." "That's crazy," said Susan, "and shame on you for even raising such a stupid idea. If we were on the Earth, we'd see planes and birds overhead. Ah, said Dave, with a sudden loudness that startled everyone. Would we though? All we see are what the liquid crystal screens show us. These windows, liquid crystal. The monitors in our helmets, also liquid crystal. We never actually see the sky with our own eyes. We can see the stars on the computers, said Susan. We're in another part of the galaxy altogether. Yes, but can you trust the computers, said Dave. That's what I'm saying. I think you should shut your mouth, said Susan. We have a responsibility here. Part of that responsibility is not to alarm the media criminals in our charge. Then, realising her words might not go down well, she added, Sorry, Chrissy, Remco. No offence. None taken, said Remco. However, if we are stuck here, I'm not sure the old laws restricting speech still apply. If they don't apply, Chrissy and I aren't criminals anymore. They still apply, said Susan. And if you ever want to live freely again, you'd better keep them in mind and behave yourself. Chrissy burst out laughing. Bog off, shouted Susan suddenly, and she stormed away. Now you've done it, said Dave. Maybe you should go and talk to her, said Remco. Dave thoughtfully examined his fork. Can't be bothered, he said. For a while they ate in silence. Then Remco said, Hey Dave, I've been thinking. We ought to start taking the agriculture more seriously. We've only got food for maybe 6 more months. There's no way I'm staying here for another 6 months, said Dave. We might not have any choice, said Remco. Humph, said Dave, and he refused to be drawn any further on the topic. A month passed by with no sign of the returning spacecraft. The potatoes and cassava grew modestly and unspectacularly. Outside, the season grew colder and a keen wind whistled across the salt plain. Dave took to shaving and showering only once every few days, and Susan frequently had dark circles under her eyes, and her eyes were often bloodshot from crying. Chrissy and Remco became increasingly insubordinate, refusing to follow Susan's orders on the grounds that her authority over them had expired. I'm thinking about hydroponics, said Remco one day at dinner. Won't work, said Dave. Why not? Said Remco. We don't have the equipment, said Dave. I think I could improvise, said Remco. If we took down part of the vehicle wall, we could... Forget it, said Dave. We can discuss it further at the weekly meeting, said Susan. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of spoons scraping against plastic dishes. Then Remco said, We should explore further out. If we took the limiters off the Caterpillar, we could probably make 150 kilometres. There's got to be... Can't you just shut your ditch hole for a bit? Said Dave. I'm just trying to be helpful, said Remco. This isn't the time, Remco, said Susan. Then when is the time? Said Remco. At the weekly meeting, said Susan, fixing him with an icy stare. At the last meeting you just went on about team building, said Chrissy. I don't see how that's a priority when we're in danger of running out of food. You're not here to think, said Susan curtly. You're here to obey. Again they lapsed into silence. Then Dave said, There's got to be some way we could look at the sky with our own eyes. Susan sighed heavily and pointedly. I just can't believe there's not one glass panel in this whole place, said Dave. We could drill a hole in the ceiling and patch it with perspex of a monitor, said Remco. Now that's not a bad idea, said Dave. And let toxic gases in, said Susan. Do you hear yourselves? I've never heard anything so stupid in my life. Also, for your information, we're not on the Earth. After that, Remco and Chrissy found they were no longer invited to eat with Susan and Dave. The weekly meetings became shorter and shorter, and often Dave didn't attend them at all. Do you think they still eat together? Said Chrissy one day, when she and Remco were working on the Caterpillar. Don't know and I don't really care, said Remco. They could be more friendly, said Chrissy. We're all in this together. Do you honestly want to hang out with those two? Said Remco. Not really, said Chrissy. Then she said, Hey Remco. Yep, said Remco. Do you think we're going to starve to death? I have a plan, Remco replied. I'm going to set up a hydroponics system. I've got it all figured out. I'll talk to Susan about it tomorrow. I reckon we can easily get through a year if I get it working, and the ship's sure to arrive before then. Probably best if you run it past Dave first, said Chrissy. He's less hard work. If he likes it, he could help convince Susan. Fair point, said Remco. I'll try him, and if they won't agree to it, I'm just going to go ahead with it anyway. The next day, Remco went looking for Dave. He found Dave in his quarters, lying on his bed, reading something on a tablet. Dave's quarters smelt of old sweat, and Dave looked like he hadn't shaved or changed his clothes in days. Hi there, said Remco, knocking on Dave's open door. What do you want? Said Dave. I want to talk to you about hydroponics, he said. No point, he said. I've got it all figured out. Dave was slurring his words slightly, which Remco found alarming. What do you mean? Said Remco. You're working on hydroponics too? Dave put the tablet down. I mean, there's no point, he said. They're testing us. This isn't real. We're in Utah or Namibia or somewhere where there's salt flats. It's obvious. Can you be serious for a moment, please? Said Remco. I am being serious, said Dave. And by the way, the alternative is they've forgotten about us and we're going to die soon. The ship's bound to return eventually, said Remco. We just need to make sure we don't starve to death while we're waiting for it. Dave raised the tablet to his eyes again. Talk to Susan about it, he said. Then he added, Captain Susan, and giggled to himself. I will, said Remco. He found Susan tinkering with the stills at the end of the long corridor that led off east from the main hall. She jumped when he coughed behind her. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you, he said. She turned round to face him. Her face looked blotchy. I've been meaning to talk to you, she said. Oh, said Remco. Yes, she said. Remco, have you been taking benzos from the medical supply? No, said Remco slowly. Why would I do that? Is Chrissy taking them? She said. You obviously haven't spoken to Dave, said Remco. He's slurring like a drunk. Susan ran her hand over her face. Okay, she said. Thanks for telling me. What is it you want? No, nothing, said Remco. Never mind, just checking you're okay. And what do you think? Said Susan sternly. Do I look okay to you? Remco backed away. Not so much, he said. If there's anything I can do... There's nothing you can do, said Susan, unless you can magically make a spaceship appear. When he got back to Chrissy, he said, Okay, here's the score. The pair of them have gone insane. Chrissy goggled at him with a trace of a smile. You better be joking, she said. I'm not completely joking, said Remco. Dave's high on benzos and smells like a goat, and Susan's all twitchy and covered in blotches. I'm telling you it doesn't look good. What are we going to do? Said Chrissy. I'm going to start work on the hydroponics and let's hope the ship arrives soon, said Remco. Oh yeah, and I almost forgot. Dave's convinced we're in Utah. Utah? Said Chrissy. What the? Salt flats, said Remco. There are salt flats in Utah. Chrissy began to laugh, covering her mouth with her hand. But her eyes registered shock as well as mirth. Exactly, said Remco. We are so screwed. Shortly after that, they received an invitation, bordering on a demand, from Susan, inviting them to lunch. When they turned up to lunch, they found Susan looking pale and angry, and Dave rather serious and miserable. It's time we started pulling together, Susan said. From now on we eat lunch together every day, whether we feel like it or not. Try not to make any sudden moves, said Remco quietly to Chrissy as they took their food from the meal dispenser. Chrissy suppressed a giggle. Dave seemed more alert than the previous time Remco had seen him. Remco guessed that Susan had clamped down on his tranquilizer use. I've been working on hydroponics, said Remco after a while. The results are quite promising. I didn't tell you to work on that, said Susan disapprovingly. I just don't want to starve to death, said Remco. You should have cleared it with me first, said Susan. We don't know when the ship will come back, said Chrissy. It's a bit alarming, isn't it? It will be back soon, said Susan. How do you know, said Remco. Because otherwise we'll die, said Susan. You should try to spend this time learning to overcome the attitude that got you here in the first place, both of you. You know, said Remco, all I did was call someone a moron. You went on holiday and forgot about his cat. To me, that's a moron. All I did was say I thought Abbott wasn't fit to be a leader, said Chrissy. Someone reported me. That's what I'm talking about, said Susan. You don't seem to understand how offensive these attitudes are. I'm afraid you've both learned nothing so far. When the ship comes back... It's not coming back, interrupted Dave. What do you mean, said Chrissy. It's not coming back because we're not on another planet, said Dave. This is almost certainly Utah. Don't start on that again, said Susan wearily. Why not, said Dave. I'm just facing up to reality. We're not in Utah, said Susan. We are in Utah, said Dave. They're watching us all the time, observing us. You're talking complete drivel, said Susan. I know how to make them show themselves, said Dave. How? Said Chrissy, her curiosity piqued. Like this, said Dave, and he took a fork and suddenly rammed it into Remco's shoulder. Remco screeched in pain. Ow, what the hell? He shouted. Susan and Chrissy stood up abruptly. Don't you see, said Dave, unfazed. Now they'll have to intervene. He needs medical attention. You psychopath, said Remco. It's only your shoulder, said Dave. It'll be fine, with proper medical attention. The fork dropped out of Remco's shoulder. A large patch of blood was soaking through his shirt and dripping on the floor. Go to your quarters immediately, said Susan to Dave. Dave looked at her blankly for a minute. Then he said, OK, whatever. Then he got up and left the hall. Susan fetched a first aid kit and started fussing over Remco. We need to get this shirt off, she said. We might have to stitch it. Susan had turned completely pale and she was shaking. You know, I think I'll just go and lie down, said Remco. It's been lovely, but I might pass on the next lunch. Sit down, said Susan. I need to see the wound. Why don't you go and check on your psycho friend, said Remco. Make sure he's not trying to chop his head off or something. Remco began to walk off, supporting his injured arm on Chris's shoulders. Come back here, shouted Susan angrily. Leave us alone, said Chrissy. You're both crazy. Remco and Chrissy walked back to their rooms, leaving a trail of blood on the floor. In the bathroom, Chrissy helped Remco to clean the wound, and after applying a dressing to it, Remco said it didn't feel too bad. It only went in about an inch, he said. Hopefully it'll heal. What's wrong with Dave? Said Chrissy. He must have really gone insane. Could be drugs, said Remco. I think I'm going to steer clear of him. It was several weeks before either he or Chrissy saw Susan again. The wound in Remco's arm seemed resistant to healing and was gradually taking on an unsettling greenish hue. You need antibiotics from the medical supplies, said Chrissy. We don't have the code. You'll have to ask Susan. I'm taking a knife in case either of them tries to stab me, said Remco. I don't think we need to worry about Susan, said Chrissy. If we see Dave, we'll just leave. The main hall was suspiciously quiet. They decided to check Susan and Dave's rooms. When they got to Dave's room, they found the keypad blinking red. indicating it had been disabled from the outside. "I think she's locked him in his room," said Remco. "Maybe he's completely lost his mind," said Chrissy, peering through the little glass window in the door into the dark room. "Do you see him?" said Remco. "Looks like the shutter's closed," said Chrissy. "I can't see anything." She pressed her face against the glass. Suddenly, Dave's face appeared inches from hers on the other side of the glass. It was streaked with blood and what looked like feces, and he was grinning derangedly. She jumped back in alarm. "Holy cow!" exclaimed Remco. "He's gone berserk. Are you okay?" Chrissy was pressing her hands against her chest. "I nearly had a heart attack," she said. "My God, look at him." Dave was still grinning horribly through the glass and seemed to be licking around the edge of the glass portal. "Let's go and find Susan," said Remco, putting an arm around her and leading her away. "What's gone wrong with him?" said Chrissy. "Probably just stress," said Remco. "I've seen it happen before." "Have you?" said Chrissy. "Well, not exactly like this, I admit," said Remco, "but I've seen people lose their minds." They found Susan in her room, the door standing open. Remco knocked tentatively. Susan was lying on her bed. She jumped and then said, "Oh, it's you." Her hair was greasy and matted, and her eyes unfocused. "We're just checking you're okay," said Remco. "Why wouldn't I be okay?" said Susan. "No reason," said Remco. "Remco's wound's infected," said Chrissy. "Could you give us the code for the medical lab?" 6142, said Susan. "Are you sure you're okay?" said Chrissy. "I'm fine," said Susan. "I'm very busy." "We won't disturb you anymore," said Chrissy. "Hey, what's going on with Dave?" said Remco. "I had to lock him in his room," said Susan. "He's having a mental breakdown." "I think he might need medical attention," said Remco. "No, he's fine," said Susan, adding, "Goodbye." Susan clearly didn't want to continue the conversation, so they left. The code for the medical lab worked, and they found antibiotics for Remco. "What are we going to do about Dave?" said Chrissy. "I'm not planning to do anything about Dave," said Remco. "I'm not a psychiatrist." "We can't just leave him," said Chrissy. "Susan doesn't seem to be in her right mind. She's just left him locked up in there. Who knows how long he's been in there?" "Last time I saw him he stabbed me with a fork," said Remco. "I don't feel like tangling with him again." "What if she's not feeding him?" said Chrissy. "You know, if he dies of starvation, they'll hold us responsible." Dave unscrewed the cap from a bottle of antibiotic pills and swallowed two, washing them down with water. "I don't really see what we can do," he said. In the following days, Chrissy continued to implore Remco to help her look into Dave's precise condition and situation. Remco said he personally didn't care if Dave chopped off his own arms and legs and declared himself a beetroot, but Chrissy felt troubled by the matter. "What if we drug him and then we can go in there and have a look at him?" said Chrissy. "How are we supposed to do that?" said Remco. "It's not safe to be anywhere near him." "Suppose we lace a bottle of Coke with tranquilizers from the medical supplies, wait till the middle of the night and throw it in," said Chrissy. "He's always drinking fizzy stuff. If he drinks it, we can go in when he's tranquilized and have a proper look at him, maybe clean him up a bit." "I suppose," said Remco. "It's worth a try," said Chrissy. When they looked for tranquilizers in the medical lab, they were unable to find any benzodiazepines. They guessed Susan had hidden them from Dave. Instead, they took some major tranquilizers of the type used to treat psychotic episodes, ground them up and dissolved them as well as they could in some Coke. "Are you really sure this is safe?" asked Remco. "If he drinks the whole thing, he'll get the kind of dose they use on acute psychiatric cases," said Chrissy. "Should be fine." At 3 a.m, Remco prized off the door keypad, connected a computer and manually overrode the keypad. "Are you sure he's sleeping?" asked Remco nervously. "I can see him on the bed," said Chrissy. shining a flashlight into the room through the portal. "Okay, open the door and I'll put the bottle inside." Chrissy pushed the door open as quietly as she could. From inside came the sound of Dave snoring. "It stinks in here," whispered Remco. He placed the bottle on the floor halfway to the bed. Then they shut the door and fitted the keypad back together. "We'll try him tomorrow afternoon," said Chrissy. "If he drinks it in the morning, he should be fairly placid by then." "What about Susan?" said Remco, holding the infected wound on his shoulder and wincing. "Never mind about her," said Chrissy. When they awoke the following day, they found themselves locked into their section. The door from the section that contained their living quarters and the vehicle bay was locked, and there was no way back into the main hall. "What is this?" said Remco, trying the lock code again on the keypad. "Let's just try to get Susan on the intercom," said Chrissy. "Maybe it's just broken." "I don't think it's broken," said Remco. He dialed in the intercom code for the main hall, and eventually Susan answered it with a curt, "Yes?" "Why have you locked us in?" said Remco. "Because you tried to poison Dave," said Susan. "We didn't poison him," said Chrissy. "We just wanted to sedate him so we can check on him." Suddenly another voice came on the intercom. It was Dave's voice, thick and slurring heavily. "Chrissy," he said. "It's not real. None of this is real. We're in Utah, Chrissy. You've got to..." Susan cut him off. "Get back in your quarters," she shouted. "I'll tase you." "We're still on the earth," shouted Dave. "Listen to me, we're still on the earth." Then he shouted in pain, and an electrical crackling sound could be heard on the intercom. "I hope you're happy," shouted Susan. "Look what you've made me do now. This is a severe breach of regulations. Both of you are going to have to be punished." "Susan, what do you mean?" shouted Remco into the intercom. "I'm reducing your oxygen supply for the next 24 hours, said Susan. Then the intercom went dead. Remco frantically pressed the communicate button, but Susan had apparently switched the intercom off. Chrissy and Remco stared at each other in shock. "She's as crazy as he is," said Remco. "What does she mean, reducing our oxygen supply?" said Chrissy. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," said Remco. "How?" said Chrissy. "The vehicle bay," said Remco. "We can get into the Caterpillar. It's got its own air supply." "She'll have it locked down," said Chrissy. "I can override it," said Remco. They made their way to the vehicle bay, Remco wincing and clutching his shoulder. "What if he's right?" said Remco. "Dave," said Chrissy. "We're not in Utah. He's insane, you know it." "Okay, but if there's even the faintest chance that he's right," said Remco. "What if he is?" said Chrissy. "If we've got to be in the Caterpillar anyway, we should explore a bit. We could go 100 kilometers easily. If we are in Utah, we'll probably hit a road." "Don't you start too," said Chrissy. "They wouldn't go to all this trouble to make us think we're on another planet if we're not." "You're probably right, but now I'm thinking, why not check?" said Remco. "Because the entire idea is insane," said Chrissy. In the vehicle bay they found everything locked down as they had expected. Remco began to try to hack the system and unlock the Caterpillar and the port airlock. After an hour, Chrissy pointed out that the oxygen level was declining. "She's really trying to suffocate us," said Remco. "It looks that way," said Chrissy. "I'm not even really surprised anymore," said Remco. "Are you going to be able to get the Caterpillar running before we run out of air?" said Chrissy. "That depends entirely on how fast the oxygen declines," said Remco. "The worst case is she's turned off the supply entirely," said Chrissy. "How long would we have then, do you think?" "I have no idea," said Remco. "I'm guessing a few hours." By the time Remco had the Caterpillar unlocked, they were both groggy, and it was hard to think straight. With enormous relief, they rolled away from the base, the Caterpillar's own system supplying them with air. "Where are we going?" said Chrissy. as far away as possible, said Remco. I want to see if there's anything here apart from salt. And if there isn't, said Chrissy, then we're going to have to find a way to bust in again and do something about Susan. For several hours they trundled along the salt flat. At one point Chrissy pointed and said, "Look." In the distance, some sort of large animal was dimly visible. "Looks like a woolly mammoth," said Remco. Soon the animal disappeared and they lapsed back into silence. "We've gone far enough," said Chrissy eventually, laying a hand softly on Remco's arm. Her touch startled him out of a reverie, and for a second he looked at her in surprise. Then he said, "I suppose you're right. There is nothing out here," she said, "apart from occasional weird animals." He stopped the caterpillar. Then he said, "How would we even know?" "What do you mean?" said Chrissy. "This is a liquid crystal screen," he said, pointing at the windscreen. "If they really wanted to convince us that we're on another planet when we're not, they could erase the roads from the view." "Would feel the caterpillar bumping on the tarmac if we hit a road," said Chrissy. "Maybe," said Remco. "Turn around," said Chrissy. "We can't risk running out of power out here." Remco sighed. Then he turned the caterpillar around. They were almost facing the base again, now 100 kilometers in the distance, when there was a blinding flash of light and an enormous fireball arose from where the base should be. "What's that?" said Chrissy in alarm. "Pretty sure that's the base," said Remco. "What's happened to it?" said Chrissy. "Susan must have short-circuited one of the reactors," said Remco. "Suicide," said Chrissy. "Yeah," said Remco. For an hour they watched as the fireball gradually dissipated. "We're going to die," said Chrissy. "We probably got another 3 days if we stay put," said Remco. Chrissy sat silently watching the smoke drifting up from where the base had once been. "How will we die?" she said. There were tears in her eyes and her voice was quavering. Remco put his arm around her. "Lack of oxygen," he said. "It won't be bad, we'll just fall asleep." Only when death was almost imminent did they notice the bright spot in the sky. It gradually moved downwards over the base, then switched course and headed directly towards them. The ship touched down 20 meters away from them. It was clearly of a new design, one they hadn't seen before. "Thank God," said Chrissy. They hugged each other in joy and relief. "Let's put the suits on and go over there," said Remco. 2.5 months later they were almost back at planet Earth. They were playing cards in the mess hall with the ship's 2 crew members, Pearson and Renfield, and the captain, Commander Sasha Roberts. "I still don't really understand why they blew themselves up," said Roberts. "What can we tell you?" said Remco. "They both went completely crazy. Dave thought we were in Utah and Susan locked him up and refused to speak to anyone." "Utah," said Renfield. "Sorry to speak ill of the dead, but they sound like absolute morons." "I've met saner and nicer people," said Chrissy, and they all laughed. "Zach though," said Remco, suddenly sobering. "I kind of miss him." "Me too," said Chrissy. "I still can't believe they used to send people to distant planets just for saying the wrong thing," said Roberts. "We have complete freedom of speech now." "Thank God for that," said Remco. "Except for blasphemy, of course," said Roberts. You've been listening to Science Horror. My name's John Purcell and all the stories on this channel are written by me. If you enjoyed this story, please solve the mystery of faster than light travel and also consider subscribing. Thank you so much. I've now reached 1,000 subscribers. To celebrate this, I've decided to turn myself into a giant cockroach. But don't worry, I'll still be recording stories for YouTube. I'll have a new story for you ready next Monday. Do join me again for that, and until then, have a good week and sleep well.